They say the moon goddess never makes mistakes. But Ruth Binder watched her sister Julia steal her fated mate with a smile sharp as broken glass. Exiled to a frozen cave, Ruth was supposed to die forgotten. Instead, she was found by a king. And when Raphael Jones claimed her as his true mate, everyone who threw her away would pay. Before we get into the story, take a second to subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to know if this story reaches Canada, the United States, Australia, Africa, or the United Kingdom. Let me know where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. The Silver Moon Pack's Harvest Moon celebration was in full swing, but Ruth Binder couldn't hear the music over the sound of her heart shattering. She stood by the frosted windows, fingers trembling around a crystal goblet as she watched Marcus Sterling, her fated mate, standing beneath the moon tapestry. The bond had snapped into place 5 days ago on her 18th birthday. The scent of cedarwood and frost. The pull that rewrote her soul. She'd been waiting for the perfect moment to tell him. But draped across his arm in white silk was Julia, Ruth's sister. The woman who had spent their entire lives taking everything Ruth dared to want. Alpha Binder's voice boomed across the hall. Tonight, we celebrate a union that will strengthen our pack for generations. No. Marcus lifted Julia's hand. Julia Binder has agreed to accept my courtship. The room exploded in applause. Across the crowd, Julia's eyes found Ruth's. Her sister smiled, cold, calculated, victorious. She knew. Julia knew about the fated bond. And she'd stolen it anyway. Ruth's mother appeared beside her. Aren't you happy for your sister? Fix your face. I'm happy, Ruth whispered. So happy I could disappear. And that's exactly what she did. Ruth ran. Not toward the neighboring packs, toward the one place no wolf dared go. The frozen falls. The forbidden border between civilization and the savage northern territories. She ran toward death. Or something far more dangerous. The Silver Moon Pack's Grand Lodge blazed with candlelight and celebration, but all Ruth Binder could see was the end of everything she'd dared to hope for. 5 days. That's how long she'd carried the secret. 5 days since her 18th birthday, when the mate bond had struck her like lightning, binding her soul to Marcus Sterling with a force that left her breathless. The scent of cedarwood and winter frost. The inexplicable pull that made her heart race whenever he entered a room. The absolute certainty that the moon goddess had chosen him for her. She'd been waiting for tonight, the Harvest Moon celebration, to pull him aside and whisper the truth that would change both their lives forever. But standing beneath the ancient moon tapestry, Marcus wasn't alone. Julia Binder moved through the crowd like a queen, white silk clinging to her curves, golden hair braided with winter berries that caught the firelight. She laughed at something Marcus said, her hand resting possessively on his arm, and Ruth's wolf whimpered in agony. She's just being friendly, Ruth whispered to herself, fingers tightening around her crystal goblet. He doesn't know. I just need to tell him first. But then Alpha Binder, Ruth's father, struck his ceremonial staff against the marble floor 3 times. The hall fell silent. My wolves, he boomed, his voice filled with pride Ruth had never heard directed at her. Tonight we celebrate more than the harvest. We celebrate a union that will strengthen our bloodlines. The goblet in Ruth's hand began to crack. Marcus stepped forward, pulling Julia with him. His dark eyes swept the room, passing over Ruth like she was invisible. No recognition. No pull. Nothing. Julia Binder has agreed to accept my courtship, Marcus announced, producing a silver bracelet etched with his family crest. We will mark each other at the next full moon. The crowd erupted. Wolves howled their approval. Ruth's mother dabbed at happy tears. And across the sea of celebrating faces, Julia turned, found Ruth's eyes, and smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of conquest. Of deliberate, calculated theft. Julia tilted her head slightly, a silent message passing between sisters. I knew. I knew he was yours, and I took him anyway. The mate bond in Ruth's chest twisted like a knife. Ruth. Her mother appeared at her elbow, voice sharp with irritation. Stop sulking. Your sister deserves happiness. An Omega can't handle a Beta mate anyway, her father added, not even looking at her. Marcus made the right choice. Julia has the strength for that position. Something inside Ruth fractured. Not broke, fractured. Like ice developing hairline cracks before the devastating split. She set down her goblet carefully. Too carefully. Congratulations, she whispered to no one in particular. Then she turned and walked toward the side entrance, her movements slow and deliberate until she pushed through the doors into the freezing night air. The moment the door closed behind her, she ran. Her body shifted mid-stride, bones cracking and reshaping until a small tawny wolf sprinted across the snow. She didn't head toward the neighboring packs. She ran toward the one place no Silvermoon wolf dared go. The frozen falls. The forbidden boundary. The border between her world and the savage northern territories. Behind her, music and laughter continued. No one noticed she was gone. No one ever did. 3 weeks. Ruth had survived 3 weeks behind the frozen falls, and some part of her couldn't believe it. The rest of her was too busy trying not to die to be impressed. The falls themselves were a monster of nature, a 300-foot cascade of water that thundered down into a churning pool below, creating a perpetual curtain of mist that turned the air to ice. The spray soaked everything within a quarter mile, freezing on contact. Icicles the size of tree trunks hung from the cliff face like the bars of a prison made of winter itself. But behind that wall of water was a secret. A cave. Ruth had found it during her first desperate night, following a narrow ledge of ice-slicked rock that would kill anyone clumsy enough to slip. Inside, the cavern opened up into a space no larger than a closet, its walls made of crystalline ice that caught and fractured what little light penetrated the waterfall. A frozen pool occupied one corner, fed by meltwater that dripped with agonizing slowness from the ceiling. It was brutal. It was freezing. It was hers. Ruth crouched near the small smokeless fire she'd learned to build deep in the cave's throat, where the smoke could dissipate into the heavy mist outside. In her hands, a rabbit she'd managed to catch that morning, her Omega instincts for tracking and patience finally useful for something other than serving others. Her ribs pressed against her skin now, sharp and visible. Her chestnut hair hung in matted tangles. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. But her eyes were clear. For the first time in her life, she wasn't Julia's shadow. Wasn't the disappointment. Wasn't the Omega too weak to matter. She was just Ruth, fighting to survive, and there was a strange power in that. She ate the rabbit slowly, savoring every bite, then crawled to the cave entrance. Through the wall of crashing water, she could see the forest beyond, painted in shades of white and gray. No one had come looking for her. She'd waited the first week, certain that someone would notice. That her mother would worry. That her father would send trackers. That maybe foolishly Marcus would feel the bond pulling him toward her. But the forest remained empty. Yesterday, she'd risked shifting and creeping close enough to the border to catch sounds of a patrol. They'd been laughing about something. About her. Heard Ruth Binder ran off with some human, one had said. Julia said she always talked about leaving pack life. Good riddance, another replied. Girl was always weird. Too quiet. Ruth had returned to her cave and hadn't cried. There were no tears left. Julia had built the perfect lie. Ruth had abandoned them, shamed the family, chosen humans over her pack. No one would look for a traitor. No one would mourn an Omega who'd never mattered in the first place. They're probably relieved I'm gone, Ruth whispered to the ice walls. Her wolf stirred inside her chest, quieter now than before, but somehow sharper. Fiercer. The bond to Marcus was withering, fading like frostbite-killing nerve endings. Soon she wouldn't feel it at all. Ruth pulled her scavenged blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared into the fire. She'd come here to die. But dying was harder than she'd expected. And somewhere in the brutal simplicity of survival, hunt, eat, sleep, repeat, she'd found something unexpected. She'd found herself. Ruth was halfway through skinning a snow hare when she heard the impossible. Voices. Over the constant roar of the waterfall, over the crash of water against stone, she heard men speaking. Her wolf surged to alertness, hackles rising. Wolves didn't come here. This was forbidden territory, the boundary between Silver Moon lands and the lawless north. No one crossed these borders. No one dared. She pressed herself flat against the ice floor, crawling toward the cave entrance. Through the curtain of water, she could barely make out movement in the mist below, shadows too large and deliberate to be animals. Two massive wolves emerged from the gray, their forms solidifying as they reached the basin pool. They weren't the scrawny, desperate rogues Ruth had imagined haunting these lands. These were warriors, sleek, powerful beasts with glossy coats that spoke of good feeding and better breeding. They shifted. Bones cracked and reshaped until two men stood in the waist-deep water, retrieving waterproof packs from a cache hidden in the rocks. The first was broad and scarred, built like a battering ram. But it was the second man who made Ruth's breath catch. He was tall, his body a map of lean muscle and controlled violence. Black armor plates covered his chest and shoulders, a fur mantle draped across his back. Dark hair hung to his shoulders, slicked back by the spray. And on his head, impossible, surreal, sat a crown of obsidian and silver that caught the dim light like captured starlight. But it was his presence that truly terrified her. Power radiated off him in waves, thick and suffocating. This wasn't just an alpha. This was something more. "We lost the trail, Your Majesty," the scarred man said, pulling on tactical gear. "Damned rogues vanished." "We didn't lose it, Kieran," the crowned man replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the rock beneath Ruth. "The scent ends here. Raphael Jones." The name crashed through Ruth's mind with sudden, terrible recognition. The Alpha King of the Northern Realm. The legend. The monster who ruled the frozen territories with absolute power. And he was standing 50 feet below her hiding place. Raphael went still, his head tilting. His nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply, frowning. "Do you smell that?" "Smell what?" Kieran grunted, checking his weapons. "Whetstone and pine." "No." Raphael turned slowly, his storm-gray eyes scanning the cliff face, the ice formations, the wall of crashing water. "Something sweet. Like frost lilies and winter honey." Ruth's heart stopped. That was her scent. But she was an Omega, her scent should be faint, easily masked by the water and mist. How could he possibly smell her through all of this? "You've been on patrol for 4 days straight," Raphael, Kieran said, though his tone was respectful. "You need sleep. You're imagining things." Raphael didn't respond. He took a step toward the waterfall, his gaze locked on the curtain of water as if he could see straight through it. Straight to her. His wolf must have been screaming. Ruth could feel it, the attention of an apex predator focusing on prey. "I'm checking behind the falls," Raphael announced. "Your Majesty, it's Suicide Slick, and we need to get back." But Raphael was already moving through the pool, approaching the ledge. Ruth scrambled backward, her heart hammering. The cave was a dead end. There was nowhere to go, no way out except past him. She pressed herself against the far wall, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. Her foot slipped. The ice beneath her cracked with a sound like a gunshot in the enclosed space. Below, both men froze. "Did you hear that?" Raphael's voice was sharper now, certain. Ruth grabbed a shard of ice, her only weapon, and waited. The sound of boots on ice began. Slow, methodical, inevitable. The predator was coming. The Alpha King pulled himself over the ledge with a grunt of effort that sounded more like a growl. He filled the cave entrance instantly, blocking out what little light penetrated from outside. Water dripped from his dark hair, running down the plates of his armor in rivulets. His storm-gray eyes locked onto Ruth. Stay back, she rasped, her voice cracking from weeks of disuse. She brandished the ice shard with trembling hands. I'll kill you. Raphael tilted his head, genuine confusion crossing his harsh features. He took in her emaciated frame, the hollows of her cheeks, the desperate weapon in her shaking grip. You're starving. I'm surviving, Ruth spat, trying to summon her wolf. But her wolf was too weak, too depleted. Nothing came. This isn't survival. Raphael's gaze swept the miserable cave, the pile of bones in the corner, the pathetic nest of stolen fabric. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. This is a tomb. He took a step forward. Ruth swung the ice shard with everything she had left. It was desperate, graceless, the strike of someone who'd never fought a day in her life. Raphael caught her wrist midair with blinding speed. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded. It wasn't the gentle warmth she'd felt with Marcus, that soft recognition of compatibility. This was a lightning strike. Violent. Absolute. Sacred. The bond detonated between them with a force that drove Ruth to her knees, every nerve ending in her body igniting at once. It rewrote her DNA, carved itself into her bones, branded itself across her soul. Raphael's pupils blew wide, swallowing the gray of his irises completely. Mine, he growled, the word vibrating with primal possession. His wolf wasn't asking. It was claiming. No, Ruth gasped, terror flooding her system. No, not again. Please not again. Her vision tunneled. 3 weeks of starvation, the shock of the bond, the hypothermia she'd been fighting, it all crashed down at once. Her legs buckled. Raphael caught her before she hit the ice, one arm sweeping beneath her knees, the other cradling her against his chest. He radiated heat like a furnace, and Ruth's frozen body responded instinctively, curling into that warmth even as her mind screamed warnings. I've got you, little wolf, Raphael murmured against her hair, his voice gentler than seemed possible from a man wearing a crown of obsidian. You're safe now. No one will hurt you again. The darkness took her. Ruth woke drowning in softness. She gasped, sitting upright, her hands scrambling for weapons that weren't there. She wasn't on the ice floor. She was in a bed, a massive bed with furs and silk sheets that smelled like pine smoke and winter storms. Easy. The voice came from across the room. Ruth's head snapped toward the sound. Raphael sat in a chair by the fireplace, no longer in armor, but in a simple black shirt and trousers. The obsidian crown was gone, but the power radiating from him remained, thick enough to taste. Where am I? Ruth croaked. My fortress. The Northern Realm. He stood, moving toward the bed with that same predatory grace. You've been unconscious for 3 days. 3 days. Ruth looked down at herself. She was clean, dressed in a soft nightgown. Someone had tended her wounds, fed her through her fever. Why? She whispered. Raphael sat on the edge of the bed, his weight making the mattress dip. You're my mate. The words hung in the air between them. Ruth felt tears burning her eyes. I can't do this again. I can't. Tell me. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Tell me who hurt you. And Ruth broke. She told him everything. Julia. Marcus. The stolen bond. The public humiliation. Her parents' dismissal. The 3 weeks in the cave. The rumors that she'd run to human lands, that no one had looked, that no one had cared. As she spoke, the temperature in the room dropped degree by degree. Frost crept across the windows. The fire guttered and died, replaced by something colder and more dangerous, Raphael's barely controlled rage. Her name, Raphael said quietly, his voice deadly calm, is Julia Binder. Yes. And Marcus Sterling chose her, knowing you were his fated mate. Ruth nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Raphael stood, walking to the window. His reflection in the frosted glass looked like a king carved from winter itself. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of an oath. They will regret throwing you away. 6 months could change everything. Ruth barely recognized the woman staring back at her from the mirror. The hollow-cheeked, starving Omega was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone with healthy curves, glowing skin, and chestnut hair that cascaded down her back in glossy waves. But the real change was in her eyes. They no longer held the defeated acceptance of someone who'd learned to make herself small. They held power. The Northern Kingdom had transformed her. Mornings were spent in combat training with Kieran, learning to defend herself with blade and claw. Afternoons in the library, studying diplomatic protocols and ancient moon goddess lore. Evenings with Raphael, learning what it meant to be seen, valued, cherished. It was during one of those library sessions that the court historian had made the discovery. Your bloodline, the elderly wolf had said, laying ancient records across the table with trembling hands. Your moonborn Luna, a descendant of the original spirit walkers. Ruth had stared at the faded text, not understanding. What does that mean? It means your Omega status was camouflage, Raphael had explained, his hand warm on her shoulder. Moonborn wolves possess a soul frequency high enough to withstand the presence of true kings. It's why you didn't collapse when I found you. Why you can stand beside me when others fall. He'd turned her to face him. You were never weak, Ruth. You were just surrounded by wolves too common to recognize royalty. Now, Ruth stood in Raphael's study, that revelation still humming through her veins, when Kieran entered without knocking. Your Majesty, the beta said, his tone carefully neutral. We have visitors at the gates. Former Alpha Binder and Marcus Sterling request an audience. Ruth's teacup paused halfway to her lips. 6 months, and hearing those names still sent a jolt through her chest. But it wasn't pain anymore. It was something colder. What do they want? Raphael asked, his voice dangerously soft. Kieran held out an envelope, sealed with the silver moon crest. They've delivered an invitation. Marcus Sterling and Julia Binder's beta coronation ceremony. Next week. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Raphael smiled. It was a smile that promised violence. How generous of them to invite us. He turned to Ruth, his storm gray eyes gleaming. What do you think, my Luna? Should we attend? Ruth set down her teacup with steady hands. Yes. Good. Raphael crossed to her, tilting her chin up with one finger. Because you're not returning as Ruth Binder, the discarded Omega. His thumb traced her lower lip. You're returning as my Luna. As their queen. The next 3 days were a whirlwind. Seamstresses arrived with bolts of fabric in silver and midnight blue. A gown was created that made Ruth look like winter personified, silk that clung to her curves before flowing into a train that whispered across marble floors. A crown was commissioned, delicate moonstone and ice crystals that caught the light like captured starlight. But it was the final preparation that sealed everything. Raphael found her the night before they were to leave, standing on the balcony overlooking his kingdom. Snow fell softly, dusting the evergreens in white. Are you ready? He asked. No, Ruth admitted. I'm terrified. Good. He moved behind her, his hands settling on her waist. Fear means you understand the stakes. His lips brushed her ear. But you're not alone anymore. Raphael, she whispered. What if seeing them breaks me again? Then I'll put you back together. He turned her to face him. But you won't break. You're not that girl anymore. He was right. She wasn't. Raphael's hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her close. Let me mark you, he murmured. Let me show them exactly who you belong to now. Ruth tilted her head, baring her throat in answer. The bite was swift, possessive, branding. When Raphael pulled back, his eyes glowed with satisfaction. The mark would be visible above any neckline, a declaration of ownership and protection that every wolf would recognize. Ruth touched the mark, feeling its heat. In the mirror's reflection, she saw herself clearly. I am not the girl they discarded, she said aloud, testing the words. Raphael stood behind her, a king at her back. No, he agreed. You're the queen who survived their cruelty. And tomorrow, you'll remind them exactly what they threw away. The convoy of black vehicles moved through Silvermoon territory like a funeral procession, slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Ruth sat in the lead car, hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. The silver gown felt like armor. The moonstone crown felt like a target. "Breathe," Raphael murmured beside her, his hand covering hers. "I'm breathing," Ruth said, though her lungs felt tight. "You're hyperventilating." He was right. Ruth forced herself to slow down, to center herself. She'd practiced this. 6 months of training, of transformation, of becoming someone new. But now, returning to the place that had destroyed her, all she could feel was the ghost of that broken Omega girl whispering that she didn't belong. "I am Moo-born," Ruth told herself firmly. "I am queen. They cannot make me small." She repeated it like a mantra as the convoy approached the pack lodge. Through the tinted windows, she could see the building ablaze with lights, wolves in formal attire gathering for the pre-ceremony reception. The vehicles stopped at the entrance. Guards stationed at the doors took one look at the banners, the silver wolf on black, and went pale. "The Northern King," one gasped, scrambling for his radio. "Someone get Alpha Binder." Raphael's door opened first. He stepped out, and the effect was immediate. Conversations died. Wolves turned, drawn by the suffocating presence of an apex predator. He stood there in black formal attire, the obsidian crown catching the torchlight, looking every inch the legend he was. Then he turned and extended his hand into the car. Ruth took a deep breath. "I am not prey. I am not invisible. I am queen." She placed her hand in his and stepped out. The silence that fell was so complete, Ruth could hear the wind in the trees. She stood there, transformed beyond recognition. The silver gown caught the light with every breath, the train pooling behind her like liquid moonlight. The moonstone crown glittered against her dark hair. But it was the mark on her neck, Raphael's claiming bite, visible and unmistakable, that made wolves instinctively lower their eyes. "Is that someone?" whispered from the crowd. "Ruth," another voice, disbelieving. "Ruth Binder." "Impossible." "She ran away." "She's alive." The whispers rippled through the gathering like wildfire. Ruth kept her chin high, her hand steady on Raphael's arm as he led her toward the entrance. Wolves parted before them like water, their bodies responding to Raphael's dominance even as their minds struggled to process what they were seeing. Ruth saw familiar faces in the crowd. Neighbors who'd ignored her. Friends who'd abandoned her. Pack members who'd believed Julia's lies without question. None of them could meet her eyes now. They walked through the massive oak doors into the great hall. Inside, hundreds of wolves in formal attire filled the space. At the far end, on a raised platform decorated with white flowers and silver ribbons, stood Alpha Binder at a podium. "Blessed to witness the union of two exceptional wolves," her father was saying, his voice booming with pride. "Marcus Sterling and my daughter Julia will lead this pack into a new era of strength and prosperity." He stopped mid-sentence. Someone in the crowd had gasped, the sound cutting through his speech. Heads turned. Conversations stuttered and died as wolves realized who had just entered. Alpha Binder's face drained of color. Beside him on the platform, Julia stood frozen in a white gown, her hand in Marcus's. Marcus, who'd gone completely rigid, his nostrils flaring as the mate bond dormant for 6 months, suddenly roared back to life. Raphael's voice cut through the shocked silence like a blade through silk. "How curious," he said, each word precise and devastating. "You're crowning a beta who built her throne on lies." Every wolf in the room turned to stare. Ruth stood at the Alpha King's side, meeting her sister's horrified gaze across the hall, and smiled. "Hello, Julia," she said softly. "Did you miss me?" Julia's champagne glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the white marble with a crystal crack, red wine spreading across the floor like arterial spray. She stood frozen on the platform, her face cycling through shock, disbelief, and then, when her eyes landed on the mark on Ruth's neck, pure, undiluted rage. Marcus stumbled forward, drawn by the mate bond that had lain dormant for 6 months. The moment Ruth entered the hall, it had detonated back to life with catastrophic force. His hand pressed against his chest, as if he could physically contain the agony. "Ruth," he breathed, the words strangled. You're alive." Disappointingly so, Ruth replied, her voice steady. Julia's shock shattered into fury. "Guards," she shrieked, her composure cracking like ice. "Remove this nobody. This is my coronation." The growl that erupted from Raphael shook the rafters. Windows rattled in their frames. Every wolf in the room instinctively bared their necks, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of an Alpha King's rage. "You dare," Raphael said, each word vibrating with lethal calm, "command guards in the presence of your queen?" The room went deathly silent. Raphael's hand settled possessively on Ruth's lower back. "Allow me to clarify for those who seem confused. Ruth Binder is Ruth Jones, Luna of the Northern Kingdom. My fated mate. The future mother of my heirs." His storm-gray eyes swept the crowd. "She outranks every wolf in this room, including your pathetic excuse for an alpha." Alpha Binder made a choking sound. The political implications were devastating. They'd exiled and abandoned the mate of the most powerful alpha on the continent. Marcus pushed through the crowd, ignoring Julia's grabbing hands. He looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, gaunt cheeks, the physical toll of a dying mate bond written across his features. "Ruth, please," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. Julia told me you'd rejected me, that you'd left for human lands." The bond, he pressed his fist against his sternum. "I can still feel it. It's been killing me slowly. We can fix this. We can." "No." The word came from Raphael, who moved faster than the eye could follow. One moment he stood beside Ruth. The next, his hand was wrapped around Marcus's throat, lifting the beta 6 inches off the floor. Marcus clawed at Raphael's forearm, gasping. "You felt the bond," Raphael snarled, his eyes glowing ice blue with barely contained violence. "You ignored it for a prettier face and a higher social standing. You chose ambition over destiny." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the silent hall. "You don't get to recycle what you threw away just because I polished it into a crown jewel." Julia screamed, a sound of pure unhinged rage. She grabbed a ceremonial dagger from the coronation display and lunged at Ruth. But Ruth wasn't the cowering Omega anymore. She sidestepped Julia's clumsy attack with grace learned from 6 months of combat training. As her sister stumbled past, Ruth caught her wrist, twisted it behind her back with precise pressure, and swept Julia's legs out from under her. Julia hit the marble hard, the dagger skittering away across the floor. Ruth leaned down, her voice soft enough that only Julia could hear. "You taught me to survive in shadows, Julia. But I learned to thrive in them." She released her sister and stepped back. Julia lay on the floor, gasping, her white gown stained with spilled wine, her carefully constructed image shattered. Around them, the pack stared in horrified silence. Raphael released Marcus, letting him collapse beside Julia. He turned to address the room, his presence absolute. "Hear me clearly," he said. "Ruth Jones is under my protection. Anyone who disrespects her, anyone who speaks ill of her, anyone who dares to contact her without explicit permission, I will interpret it as an act of war against the Northern Kingdom." His gaze found Alpha Binder. "Choose your next words very carefully." He offered Ruth his arm. "Shall we go home, my Luna?" Ruth took it, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes." They turned and walked out, leaving behind a shattered coronation, 2 broken wolves on the floor, and an entire pack choking on their collective guilt. The door closed behind them with a satisfying finality. The carriage pulled away from the Silver Moon Lodge, leaving chaos in its wake. Ruth sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the devastation to hit. For the pain. For the regret. It never came. How do you feel? Raphael asked quietly. Ruth considered the question. She felt lighter. Freer. Like she'd been carrying a weight for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. I feel nothing, she said, surprised by the truth of it. I thought seeing them would hurt, but all I feel is relief. Raphael pulled her against his side. Good. They deserve nothing from you. Not even your pain. 6 months later, Ruth stood in the frost throne room of the Northern Kingdom, every inch the queen she'd become. The room was designed to intimidate, walls of ice and obsidian, windows that looked out over frozen peaks, her throne carved from a single piece of glacial ice that never melted. Kieran entered, his expression grim. Luna, you have visitors requesting an audience. Former Alpha Binder and Marcus Sterling. Ruth's hand tightened on the armrest. Show them in. They looked terrible. Alpha Binder had lost significant weight, his expensive suit hanging off a diminished frame. But Marcus looked worse, gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving like every step caused him pain. Thank you for seeing us, Luna Jones, Alpha Binder said, his voice lacking its former authority. We come to beg for mercy. Speak, Ruth said, her tone neutral. Silvermoon is collapsing, her father admitted. Since the coronation disaster, we've lost 3 territories to neighboring pacts. Families are leaving. Resources are depleted. The council has sanctioned us. He swallowed hard. We're dying. Marcus stepped forward, his hands trembling. I ended things with Julia, he said desperately. The moment you left that night, I knew I'd made a mistake. The mate bond, Ruth, it's been killing me. I can't eat. Can't sleep. Every day it gets worse. He felt his knees. I need you. Please. We can still fix this. Ruth looked down at the man she'd once thought was her destiny. She felt pity. Nothing more. You don't need me, Marcus, she said quietly. You need relief from pain. That's not the same as wanting me. I do want you. You want the bond to stop hurting, Ruth interrupted. You don't want Ruth Binder, the Omega you ignored. You don't even know who I am. The throne room doors opened. Raphael entered, moving to stand behind Ruth's throne, not claiming the moment, but positioning himself as her support, her foundation. Ruth stood. Marcus Sterling, I need you to understand something. The bond you feel? It's a corpse. It died the night you chose my sister. What you're experiencing is phantom pain from something that's already gone. She descended the steps, stopping a few feet from him. And I'm done being haunted by ghosts. Ruth took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. I, Ruth Jones, born Binder, reject you, Marcus Sterling. I deny your claim. I sever your hold. I cast you out. The sound was audible, a crack like ice breaking on a frozen lake. Marcus screamed, a raw, agonized sound as the metaphysical connection was ripped out by the root. He collapsed, convulsing on the floor. Ruth felt the final thread snap inside her chest. The weight she'd carried for a year gone. Just gone. Remove them, Raphael ordered the guards. And deliver a message. If they cross our borders again, they'll face permanent exile from all pact territories under Northern Kingdom protection. The guards dragged the sobbing men away. The doors closed. Ruth stood in the sudden silence, tears streaming down her face. Raphael was beside her instantly. Ruth. I'm not sad, she said, laughing through the tears. I'm finally free. He pulled her into his arms, and Ruth buried her face in his chest, crying tears of relief, of release, of a future that was finally, truly hers. The fire roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the private chambers of the Northern King and Queen. Snow fell softly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the world in shades of white and silver. Ruth sat curled in Raphael's arms, wrapped in furs, feeling more at peace than she'd ever thought possible. Tell me about the Moonborn prophecy again, she murmured. Raphael's fingers traced idle patterns on her shoulder. The ancient texts say that once every few generations, the moon goddess births a wolf with a soul frequency high enough to balance the most powerful alphas. They're marked by an Omega designation, not because they're weak, but because their power needs to be hidden until the right time. He tilted her chin up to meet his gaze. Your Omega status was never weakness, Ruth. It was camouflage protecting sacred power until you were ready to claim it. Ruth was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words. Then she took his hand and placed it flat against her stomach. I have something to tell you, she said softly. Raphael went still. Then his eyes widened as his heightened senses caught something she'd discovered only that morning. His hand pressed more firmly against her abdomen, his expression shifting from confusion to wonder. 2 heartbeats, he whispered, his voice cracking. Ruth. Twins, she confirmed, tears already streaming down her face. The healer confirmed it this morning. Moonborn heirs. The Alpha King of the Northern Realm, the warrior who'd built an empire through blood and strategy, who'd never shown weakness in 30 years of rule, buried his face against Ruth's stomach and wept. His shoulders shook with the force of emotions he'd kept locked away for a lifetime. I thought I'd never have this, he said against her skin. Never have a family. Never have a future worth protecting. He looked up at her, tears tracking down his scarred face. And then I found you freezing in a cave, half dead, and you gave me everything. Ruth stroked his hair, her own tears falling freely. She thought about the girl who'd fled into the frozen wilderness 6 months ago. The broken Omega who'd believed she was worth nothing, who'd gone to the frozen falls to disappear. If she could speak to that girl now, she would say, hold on. Your true story hasn't begun yet. The pain is just the prologue. Raphael stood, pulling Ruth with him to the window. His hand settled over her stomach, protective and possessive. Outside, the Northern Kingdom stretched endlessly, a realm of ice and strength, of loyalty and chosen family. Look, Raphael murmured, pointing to the sky. The moon was rising full and luminous, turning the snow-covered landscape into something magical. Ruth's reflection stared back at her from the window glass. She wore her crown not as decoration but as truth. The moonstone caught the light, throwing prisms across her face. She was Ruth Jones, Luna Queen, mother of heirs, beloved mate, moonborn sovereign. She was everything they'd said she could never be. They thought discarding me would erase me, Ruth said quietly, her hand covering Raphael's on her belly. But you can't erase the moon, can you? No, Raphael agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. You can only wait for her to rise again. Ruth smiled, watching the moon climb higher. Brighter and more powerful than before. Somewhere in Silvermoon territory, Julia and Marcus were living with the consequences of their choices. Somewhere, her parents were watching their pack crumble. Somewhere, people who dismissed her were realizing exactly what they'd thrown away. But Ruth didn't waste energy on hatred or revenge. She didn't need to. The greatest revenge wasn't destruction. It was becoming so radiant, so powerful, so completely whole that those who dimmed your light could only watch from the darkness they'd chosen. Ruth Jones stood in her kingdom, her king beside her, her children growing inside her, and knew with absolute certainty. She had won. Not because she'd destroyed her enemies, but because she'd refused to let them destroy her. And in the end, that was the victory that mattered most. So what did you think of Ruth's journey from Broken Omega to Moonborn Queen? That transformation hit different, didn't it? If you loved watching Ruth go from hiding in a frozen cave to wearing a crown beside the Alpha King, smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. Drop a comment below, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you do not want to miss the next drama. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the people who discard you are just making room for your real destiny to find you. See you in the next story. Crescent Moon Crown.